Comics are physical, webcomics are not. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe. Alright, don't worry. This isn't a 20-minute video beating around the bush about the most obvious difference between comics and webcomics. It's not just on Webtoon and netcomics you can read comics free online, but for Marvel and DC comics you've got to pay for a magazine. Yeah, it's easy to just say that traditional print comics are physical while online comics are digital and leave it at that, but they're completely different mediums with their own unique storytelling methods. Even the most popular genres are on opposite ends of the spectrum. When you really get down to it, comics and webcomics are very different. And if you still think that's the only difference by the end of the video, then I'll, I don't know, come to your house and give you a high five and a weasel or something. I'm Aura, welcome to the Zombie Comics channel, and the story about superheroes and South Korean romance, infinite canvases, censorship, and free comics online. It's the story of what is the difference between comics and webcomics. Speaking of stories, the most popular comic books lean more towards superhero tales, while webcomics nowadays are usually a lot more romantic. And Korean. Okay, admittedly, this isn't really an exclusive difference between comics and webcomics. It's not like there's anything holding you back from publishing your totally not BTS yaoi romance dramedy in physical form, but comics and webcomics developed in vastly different environments. So, naturally, very different genres became the heavy hitter for each. This is one of the looser differences between comics and webcomics, so I wanted to hit on it first before getting into the meatier things. Comics have been around since, 1837, with the adventures of Mr. Obadiah Oldbuck, reading like a 19th century version of ye olde relatable humor that's honestly never died off. I don't care if you're talking about Garfield or Pizza Cake comics, one-off relatable gags told in only a few panels is a staple of both print and digital comics. But even still, the type of relatability is different. Charlie Brown is relatable when his kites are eaten by a tree, while online comics might joke about how hopelessly addicted we are to our phones, or you'll see comics about shared experiences with a video game or video game fandom. Fittingly, relatable comedy and physical comics focus on everything that happens in the real world, while relatable digital comedy tends to focus on our experiences in the digital world. And when we get into long-form storytelling, like comic books and webcomics with an ongoing narrative, the content differences become even more obvious. On one hand, we have superheroes. On the other, we have Korean romance dramas. Superheroes came about not long after comic books. It really boils down to the fact that in the late 1930s and 40s, we just needed superheroes. The undercover detectives with false identities from pulp novels were already incredibly popular at the time, and with lots of people needing escapism from the harsh reality of the world wars, superheroes debuted in the newest medium at the perfect time, and the two have been tangled ever since. Compare that to webcomics. The internet was a very, very different place when the first webcomics hit the World Wide Web. Online culture was aggressively unregulated, for better or worse, and so the most popular webcomics back then tended to rely on crude humor or pop culture references. They were good for a quick laugh, but they didn't tend to get people invested and talking. And nothing does that better than romance drama.
And they were roommates.
Oh my god, they were roommates.
Once webcomics like Lore Olympus hit the mainstream, that was it. According to the general public, webcomics were prime for romance stories.
It's free real estate.
So people started seeking out online comics for romance specifically, and where there's demand to be filled, the most market-savvy artists step up. And at a certain point, things kind of went up.
Who makes all these?
For those living under a rock, the MCU movies are stupidly successful worldwide. And all of those characters were made in America. All of the top grossing movies are from Hollywood. Yeah, the US media tends to overshadow everyone else a lot of the time. If you ask most of the world outside of South Korea in 2012, hey, do you like K-pop? They'd be like, what the hell are you talking about? But the internet provides a platform for anyone in the world to take off. Without going into too much detail, the South Korean government pumped a lot of money into their media enterprises, and it paid off when it went worldwide. Suddenly, everywhere you looked, you had K-dramas, K-pop groups like BTS, South Korean animators and artists. It's why so many of the top webcomics across several sites are these Korean romance dramas or slice-of-life stories. So on the physical comic side of thing, to the surprise of literally no one, business data shows that American comic book publishers Marvel and DC account for more than 60% of comic book sales worldwide. But America isn't the lead when it comes to webcomics. I feel like I'm forgetting something important. Something about Webtoon. Oh yeah, Webtoon is literally South Korean. Webtoons has basically become a synonym for webcomics. It's the largest platform for hosting online comics, and since it was founded in South Korea by Jungkook Kim, it's naturally going to inspire more South Korean artists to produce webcomics. But that's enough about genres and comic producers. Let's talk about how the very mediums of physical and digital comics really set the two apart. Let's put ourselves back in high school for a second. I promise this scenario is related, just bear with me. You're taking notes in a notebook, your pen or pencil gliding across the page, when the teacher says an obnoxiously long word. You go to write it, but you realize you're just close enough to the edge of the page that you can't comfortably write the word out. You're faced with a lose-lose compromise. You either write increasingly small and jam the letters together in an uncomfortable mess, you skip to the next line and leave a giant gaping white space, or you write half the word and hyphenate the rest of the word to the next line. Personally, I hate all three options. It feels so weirdly restricting that you couldn't just make more space. And this is what I believe is the actual biggest difference between comics and webcomics. When it comes to traditional print comics, you only have so much space on the page. That means fixed dimensions, resolution caps, and hard fast lines that you can't generally cross. Meanwhile, for webcomics, they operate on what is called the infinite canvas. It's the theoretical infinite space in which a webcomic can be produced in. The term comes from Reinventing Comics by comic book writer, cartoonist, and comic theorist Scott McCloud.
Hold it right there!
I'm sorry, comic theorist? That's a title someone can have? Anyway, according to Fox McCloud, it's best to think of the infinite canvas like this. Instead of viewing your computer monitor as a page, instead think of it as a window. There's not one static image beyond. You can look further to the left or to the right, up or down, or bring things further into focus. A webcomic can be as big as a computer screen. It can be as big as a movie theater screen. It can be literally miles long. Thanks to the power of scrolling, a single webcomic can be as big and elaborate as you want. If you want a prime example of this in action, just think of the tower format you see on Webtoon. You start at the top of a page, and then you scroll down, and you just keep on going, never having to stop to turn the page or break the flow of your reading, because you can just do that in webcomics. But the tower format isn't just good for a unique way to tell stories, it's also very practical when it comes to what most people are reading comics on nowadays. It's no secret that print comics have been struggling for a while. If you're not affiliated with Spider-Man or Batman or Superman, print comics have an uphill battle, and that's trickled back to affect brick and mortar comic shops. And a big part of that is because most people are reading free comics online, more specifically on their phones. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but phone screens and computer screens aren't the same. Sure, with the infinite canvas, you can make a webcomic bigger than the Titanic, but the reader probably doesn't care. They want something accessible, something that takes advantage of the portrait orientation of their phones versus landscape. And that's why the tower format is reigning supreme. Beyond practicality, it fundamentally changes how the story flows. In physical comics, you're actively turning the page to reveal a whole splash of new panels, new dialogue, shocking events that you read quicker to reach. But you can only control that sort of pacing so much. The tower format gives you almost complete control of the pacing. Do you want to visually represent a pause? Boom, more white space between panels. Want to emphasize some dialogue? Boom, put it alone floating between the panels. Honestly, this is why I wanted to make the video. The difference between comics and webcomics isn't just one uses ink and one uses pixels. They both present completely different ways to tell stories and weave narrative beats. Also, the more relaxed censorship laws. I made a Zelda comic. I point blank use characters from Nintendo's The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, and I even used direct lines of dialogue from it. And I didn't get the pantsuit off of me. If I had printed this, I likely would have gotten the pantsuit off of me. FBI, open up! And the reason I can do this without fear of legal repercussions? Because everyone else is doing it. I'm not kidding. That's generally the whole reason you can post blatant copyright infringement online without worrying about a company kicking your door down and dragging your ass to court. Simply put, there is so much copyright infringement on the internet that if companies focused on going after every single case, they would not have time to do anything else. Collectively, we generate 2.5 quintillion bytes of data every day. I mean, if we compiled into books everything posted to the internet over the course of a day, we would have enough to stack to the moon. And back. And that's compiling one day's worth of internet content. Spider-Man comes out once a month. Copyright laws really aren't any more relaxed online than in the real world, they're just not as strictly enforced. So webcomics can get away with a lot less censorship than print comics. Usually. The first webcomics online learned real fast that getting too much attention can result in companies and rights holders bringing down the legal hammer. But I already talked about that in a past video, which you should definitely check out. Webcomics have a wild history, and a surprising amount of witches. And if you want to check out more videos like that in the future, definitely subscribe and let me know what else you'd like to hear about regarding webcomics, animated series, still gotta get into those, and more. But long story short about copyright laws and censorship, webcomics are allowed to be a lot more free with that sort of thing than print comics simply because they tend to fly further under the radar. Now, if Lore Olympus suddenly included the Disney version of Hercules, the author would definitely get swatted by the mouse because Lore Olympus is massive. You can find merch of it at Hot Topic. It doesn't fly under the radar. There's no magical line of when your online property becomes big enough for companies to sue you, so I can't help you there. But yeah, personally, I think the difference between comics and webcomics is night and day. Whether you're talking about genres, who makes them, the very structure of how these stories are presented, all of it's different. And in the end, let's be honest, no one is correcting anyone if they think the two are only separated by physical and digital mediums. Basically, all this information is good for is actuallying your friends. Welcome to internet documentaries. So, I've been Aura from Zombie Comics, and I'll catch you on the flip side. See ya.